Okay, so now that we know that there's good evidence for evolution and that it's occurring, we need to talk a little bit about how exactly this process of natural selection happens so that it leads potentially to evolution and different species. So, to talk about that, we need to do a little bit of review of our genetics because it's the genetics, as we kind of looked at with the last section at the very end, that really drives this process. So, if we look at all of the genes that are present, we can talk about something called the gene pool, and that is the combined genetic information of all members of a population. And obviously, depending on the individuals that are present, that can change. And with those changes, and even with things like mutations occurring, we can actually change the gene pool. Now, we also talk about something called gene frequency. Gene frequency is basically the number of times an allele occurs in a gene pool compared with the number of times other alleles occur. So if you think to genetics, it's kind of like the percentages, but this is percentages of phenotype that we actually see present in the population. Now, how do we get the variation that we see there within the gene pool and in the gene frequencies? Well, new changes can occur via mutations. Remember, mutations are any change in the sequence of the DNA, but in order for it to continue on in a population, remember, it has to occur in the gamete. It has to be in either the sperm or the egg. We also get mutations through sexual reproduction. That is, the largest actually source of our genetic variation, because we get gene shuffling that happens during meiosis. We get crossing over that happens during meiosis, and we get fertilization, which is a brand new combination of genes that has never occurred before. So all of these things provide new combinations which lead to variations in our populations. All right, so why do we talk about genes then when we're talking about evolution? Well, that's because we know that our inheritable traits are actually controlled by genes, and that changes in the genes and chromosomes are what generate the variation for natural selection to work on. With no variation, we can't have natural selection. If every single individual in a population is identical, we can't have natural selection occurring. So, in genetic terms, evolution is a change in the relative frequency in the gene pool of a population over time. Now, this doesn't always lead to true evolution, because when we think of actual evolution, we think of new species being risen or being created, and that takes more than just a single allele. You can't just change one thing about an organism and say that it's a new species. So this is something that does take a lot of time in order to happen. Now, when we look at the genetics, we talk about something called evolutionary fitness. So, we talked about survival of the fittest. This is kind of, tying this in. This is the ability and the success that individuals with particular genes have in passing their genes to the next generation. If you are not fit, if you have a trait that makes you not fit, it makes you different in a bad way, it means that your chances of survival are lower. This could be something that wasn't your fault, for instance. You could have a trait that worked perfectly well at one point, but because of changes in the environment, all of a sudden that variation that you have doesn't work as well. So it can be kind of a tricky thing to understand, because there is a little bit of luck involved, because it's not just genetics and it's not just the environment. It's both of them. So when we talk about adaptations, we're talking about an evolutionary adaptation. This is a genetically controlled trait that increases the individual's ability to pass along its alleles. So, with the zebra, if it has a trait that allows it to run faster, that's going to allow it to outrun those cheetahs better, which means it's got a better chance of surviving to pass that fast running gene onto its descendants. So over time, we end up with a very a population of zebras that can run really, really fast. Well, guess what? If the cheetahs don't keep up and the cheetahs aren't, getting that fast gene, then they also will have some changes in their population because they're not going to be able to eat as well. So, sorry, I don't know why I have that twice there. Okay, so evolution is any change in the relative frequency of alleles in a gene pool of a population over time. Okay. So natural selection, though, so evolution refers to the population. Natural selection is what happens on individuals. So natural selection is something that happens to individual organisms, and then the group as a whole will evolve. So, but it's the natural selection that changes the frequencies in the population. So what you have to keep in mind that it's populations, not individuals, that evolve. And we already talked about this, but just keep in mind mutations may or may not affect fitness. Some mutations can actually be lethal or lower fitness, but others can be beneficial. Mutations can matter in evolution only if they can be passed from generation to generation. So the mutation has to happen in the cells that produce either the eggs or the sperm, which we kind of talked about before. So the bigger evolutionary driver with natural selection is sexual reproduction. Mutations have a place, but they're not as big of a factor as sexual reproduction is. So let's look at how evolution can happen on something like a single gene trait. So if I have a single gene that controls a trait, I'm going to have two alleles. So like light-colored fur and dark-colored fur, two alleles. Okay. So the gene variation gives us only two phenotypes. I have two options, light or dark. That's it. And it actually makes it, the balance easier to see. Polygenic is a little bit more challenging, but we'll get to that here in a second. But that's what we're talking about. So let's take a look here at how this can happen. We're going to go back to that frog worksheet in your handout packet. So here we have a population of frogs, and we can see how they are changing over time. Now we have a light-colored frog and we have a dark-colored frog. And as the years progress, we're getting more and more and more dark-colored frogs. Now that could be because of a change in the environment. Again, year one, the light-coloreds had it okay, but something happened through no fault of their own probably, and the environment changed. And so now we see that the light-colored frogs are standing out maybe for predators or for some other reason that's tied to their skin color, and they're not being as successful. So let's complete the table here. All we have to really do is count, which is kind of nice. We can count. All right, so in year one, we had 6 light-colored frogs and 2 dark-colored frogs. In year 2, we had 4 and 4. In year 3, we had 2 and 6. And in year 4, we had 0 and 8. Now, I will tell you that usually the one allele doesn't completely go away. It may decrease in its amount, but it usually doesn't completely get buried because you just can't completely eliminate a trait from a population, especially in such a short amount of time. Okay, so let's answer the question at the bottom. How did the numbers of light-colored and dark-colored frogs change over time? Well, the light one increased and the dark one decreased. So here we see we've got individuals getting selected. So we have natural selection happening, and the population, the group as a whole, is changing. That's what we're looking for. Now, with a polygenic trait, we have something that's controlled by 2 or sometimes more genes, and each gene has 2 or even more alleles. So it gets a lot complicated a lot more quickly. We can have many phenotypes and many genotypes. So we get lots of variation. So the more genes that control a trait and the more alleles that control a trait, when we actually end up plotting it, we end up with something like this. For instance, phenotype. If we took all of the students in the school and we grouped them by their height, we would actually kind of come up with this pretty smooth bell-shaped curve because we probably wouldn't have gaps. We've got some individuals, few of them at the lower range, we've got a few of them at the upper end of the range, but a lot of people would be in the middle. But we would get kind of this smooth curve. All right, so those are the situations that we're dealing with. So let's look at how we can have evolution as genetic change. So natural selection can lead to changes in the allele frequency and therefore to evolution. A good example of this is the peppered moth. The peppered moth actually has two color variations, the light one and the dark one. And before the Industrial Revolution, you used to be able to find a lot of light-colored moths over in the London area. But with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, they used a lot of coal in their factories. So the birch trees, actually, the bark of it turned darker, which gave this dark variation a competitive advantage. So you saw the shifting in the alleles. The number of light went down, the number of dark went up. And now, since we've instituted clean air, some restrictions on the factories, we've actually seen a shift back to the light color being the more dominant as the bark of the trees have changed. Again, the environment is changing. That environmental pressure or that environmental change is actually selecting which peppered moths are able to survive, which ones are better able to camouflage. All right, so we can actually kind of see this here with the mouse. Worksheet. So a color mutation occurred in a brown mouse population, causing darker fur. The table below shows how the population changed over the next 30 generations. So initially we had 90% of the population was the light, 10% was the dark, and you can see how things progressed from there. So what is happening to the relative frequency of the lighter fur color allele? It is decreasing. What is happening to the relative frequency of the darker fur color? It is increasing. So, based on that, is the darker color mutation favorable or unfavorable? Well, obviously it is favorable. If it's favorable, you get that increase with a single gene trait. What might cause the change shown in the table? Well, it's probably most likely some sort of change in their environment, and that could be anything. It could be that the mice live in some urban areas, so maybe the builders are starting to use a darker colored stone, which allows them to camouflage better. There could be a number of reasons, but it's probably some sort of change in their environment. How do you predict the mouse population will look after 40 generations? The lighter color will be even less, and the darker color will be even more. All right, I'm sorry about that. I had a major coughing fit come on. All right, so let's now take a look and kind of finish up this section by talking about how natural selection works on polygenic traits. So we can actually affect a polygenic trait in three ways: directional selection, stabilizing selection, and disruptive selection. So let's talk first about directional selection. With directional selection, if we take a look at that initial curve we have, one end, it could be the upper end or lower end, depending on the environmental change, has a higher fitness. And so the entire curve shifts either to the left or to the right. So here we go. So we've got this particular finch that has a range of beak sizes, and a certain type of food becomes scarce. Specifically, the size of the seed. Smaller beaks can't break bigger seeds. They're just not as tough and strong. So these guys up the upper end have a better fitness. They are better able to break open those seeds and get food. So there's going to become more of them. These guys down here with the smaller beaks, they're not going to be able to eat. They're going to die off. So there will become less of them. So what we'll see is this is the original curve here on the dotted. So the whole curve shifts over to the right in this case. So you have to look at the environmental change and kind of think logically, what is going to happen? So let's take a look here at our handout. Okay? A population of birds eats seeds. Small seeds can be eaten by birds with small beaks. Larger, thicker seeds can only be eaten by birds with larger, thicker beaks. Suppose there is a shortage of small seeds, but there are still many large seeds. So if there's a lot of large seeds, then the larger end here of the curve is going to have a higher fitness. So we are going to see a shifting here of the curve to the right. So the new curve would look something like this. Okay. So, which birds in this population have the highest fitness? Those are the large-beaked birds. Explain how natural selection could lead to the change that you predicted. Well, the small-beaked birds would actually die out because of a food shortage, whereas the large-beaked birds would have their numbers increase because they are more able to get the food. So because they're able to get the food, they are better able to survive to pass that gene on to the next generation. Now, directional selection is actually kind of the easy one of the three. The other two, it's not that they're complex or complicated, you just have to kind of think a little bit. All right, so the next one is the stabilizing selection. In the stabilizing selection, individuals near the center of the curve have a higher fitness. So the center stays at the current position, but the graph itself narrows. So this is what you kind of see here. We've got birth weight versus percentage of population. So selection against the extremes, for whatever reason, narrows the curve but keeps the curve in the same place. So it's just, it kind of gets a little bit taller in the center, but it doesn't shift left or right. Now, disruptive selection, this is the one that tends to lead to evolution, true evolution, because what happens is individuals at both ends of the curve have higher fitness. So both the upper end and lower end, the individuals in the center, for whatever reason, have less ability to survive. So the curve can actually split at this point, creating two distinct phenotypes, and with this change combined with some others, we can actually get a new species. All right, so we see this here, where the large seeds and small seeds become more common, so the medium-sized seeds aren't as common, so we actually get this kind of dip. Okay, the dotted line is the old curve, the solid line is the new curve, so we get less fitness in those medium-sized beaks, and the small and large have more. All right, we'll go over to the handouts because it actually combines these. In most populations, a trait that has higher fitness leads to greater numbers of organisms with that trait. On the graphs, dotted lines represent the original population. The solid lines represent the population after selection has taken place. So first of all, we have to identify whether each graph shows stabilizing or disruptive selection and write the type of selection shown in each graph. So in the one on the left here, okay, we can see that the center of the curve is going up, okay, and the sides are coming in. This is stabilizing. With the one on the right, okay, we can see that the middle of the curve dips down and we get that split. That is disruptive. All right, under which type of selection do organisms in the middle of the curve have the highest fitness? That is stabilizing. In disruptive selection, organisms represented by which part of the curve have the lowest fitness? That is the middle of the curve. Describe a situation that might lead to the changes shown in the graph on the right, which is the disruptive. So let's just use the seeds. Medium seeds become scarce, whereas the small and large ones become plentiful or abundant. Okay. Now, we do have some other things that can cause changes in gene frequency that we just need to kind of briefly discuss here. within populations. So one of the things is what we call genetic drift. Genetic drift is where we have a random change in allele frequency, and this tends to affect small populations because we see it more. If we only have a few number of individuals, one small change with one individual is going to create a big percentage difference. Now we have two types of genetic drift that can occur. The first one is what we call the bottleneck effect. This is a change in allele frequency following a dramatic reduction in the size of the population. So what happens here is the diverse population undergoes a tragedy and many members die. So the new population is created and it differs from the original group. So here's an example of the bottleneck scenario. So we have a population of ladybugs with both red and yellow. We have a lot of them die and only these two red guys survive. So the two red guys may or may not have that yellow gene. So when they create the population, at least initially, you're going to get a lot of red and very few yellow. The other one is called the founder effect. The founder effect happens because a very small subset of the population migrates and creates a new population. So the two groups, so if we took two groups from a large diverse population, you can actually create new populations that differ from the original group. So let's use our ladybugs again. So I've got the original or these are beetles, I guess. You just grab a few. Well, notice here I don't have any reds, so my descendants probably won't have any red. Whereas if I grab these guys and bring them over, I've only got the red and the yellow and then dots and some no dots, and so that's what I end up in my population. I have none of those gray. And it's just because I only take a small subset, and because that small subset doesn't necessarily represent everybody in the population, that's where that occurs. All right, the last thing we need to talk about is kind of a important thing with this whole idea of genetic change and evolution, and it's called the Hardy-Weinberg principle. The Hardy-Weinberg principle describes the conditions under which genetic equilibrium is reached, and therefore evolution does not occur. Now, this is a principle, but you will see it's going to be really, really hard for this to actually take place. So this is basically describing this is the only way that evolution can't happen genetically. So the Hardy-Weinberg principle states that allele frequencies in a population remain constant, in other words, they maintain genetic equilibrium, unless one or more factors cause these frequencies to change. So in order for genetic equilibrium to be maintained, there are 5 things that must stay. You must maintain a large population. You cannot have any individuals moving in or out of a population. You can have no natural selection taking place. You must have completely random mating, and you can have no mutations. So just from reading that list, you should get an idea that this is pretty difficult to do. So let's go through these a little bit. Large population. Why do you need a large population? Well, that's because genetic drift can cause changes in small populations. It has less effect in large ones. So why no mutations? Well, new mutations create new alleles potentially, and so therefore the allele frequencies will change, which can lead to evolution. I can't have individuals moving in and out of the population because, again, they may introduce new alleles, and they may, if they leave, they could remove alleles from the gene pool. Random mating. I know that sounds weird. Okay, all members of the population would have to have equal opportunity to produce offspring. So individuals must mate with other members of the population at random. So some of the courtship behaviors we see with organisms just can't take place because they're actually choosing their mates that way and competing for their mates, and that's not random. There can be no natural selection. In other words, all genotypes have to have this equal probability of surviving or reproducing, so no phenotype can have a selective advantage over the other. So as you can see, this is something that is really, really difficult to maintain, and so we typically have natural selection and evolution taking place. Now, whether or not it creates a new species is yet to be determined, and we'll talk about that in the next video.